times. It's interesting. Couldn't find it.
Well, thanks a lot, Dan and Ellen. And I'll be perfectly honest about this. This is a slightly modified version of a history program I put together 6 or 7 years ago for the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics National Aerospace Sciences meeting. And
you said it was Benoist.
Touched it up a little bit to correct a couple of things that I had in it. But anyway, this is the whole deal. And that's my current life. I'm a professor of mechanical engineering down at Washington University now, having retired 1.5 years ago from the airplane factory. But here we go. Tom Benoist, Thomas Wesley Benoist, was St. Louis' first aeronautical entrepreneur, one of the area's first industrialists, and arguably one of this country's true aviation pioneers. Benoist actively participated in all aspects of the new and expanding world of aviation. He designed, manufactured, and marketed airplanes and related hardware. He flew both as an instructor and as an exhibition flyer, and he ran an aerial exhibition company, and equipped and operated the world's first regularly scheduled airline. We'll get to that momentarily. And he accomplished all of this in the short span of less than 10 years of aviation activity before his untimely demise, which I'll touch upon later. Thomas Wesley Benoist, born in Irondale, Missouri in 1874, was a successful automotive businessman in St. Louis when he was exposed to the brand new world of aeronautics at the Great Louisiana Purchase Exposition, which was popularly known then and now as the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. At the fair, Benoist was a participant in aeronautical activities by virtue of being among the sponsors of a novel helicopter of noted balloonist John Barry's unsuccessful attempt to win the $100,000 grand prize that was offered at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition for aeronautical accomplishments. And Barry had designed a novel helicopter-like lighter-than-air flying machine, which turned out to be unsuccessful. But in addition to backing that, Benoist was able to take a ride in this spectator balloon that was reeled up over the fairgrounds, and for a nominal fee, who knows, maybe 2 bits, a guy could climb in the basket there and be reeled up to over 100 feet altitude above the fairgrounds and get a bird's eye view, if you will, of the whole place. And so Tom took advantage of that, and he also was a spectator at the glider flights that were made with this Benoist Type glider. It was a replica of the glider that had been very successfully flown on the Lake Michigan sand dunes by Octave Benoist and his protégés, which included a Chicago carpenter by the name of William Avery. Now, inspired by all of this, Benoist continued to pursue his automotive career, including with his brother the invention of an improved storage battery for automotive use. But he found himself increasingly absorbed with thoughts of aviation. By mid-1908, he and a partner had opened the Aeronautical Supply Company, which was shortened to Orosco, the first supply house in the country devoted to the sale of aeronautical parts and supplies. Initially, Orosco, which had a shop on, I believe, on Delmar in what would now be U City. Initially, Orosco dealt only with the raw materials needed by aeronautical experimenters. For example, bicycle wheels, motorcycle parts, piano wire, and various kinds and forms of wood. Before long, Orosco was marketing complete kits from which the purchaser could assemble one of the successful airplane types of the day, such as a Wright Flyer, Curtiss biplane, Blériot monoplane, Farman biplane, and so on. Up to this point, Benoist's involvement in aviation had been limited to the business aspects. That changed on September 18, 1910, when Benoist made his first flight as a pilot, this at the Kinloch Flying Field, which is where the 1910 aviation meet would take place a couple of weeks after Benoist made this flight. But he made his first flight as a pilot, flying what you can see is a Curtiss type biplane. It's got the interplane ailerons that were a typical Curtiss evolution at the time, and in general layout looked like a Curtiss configuration. But this airplane had been, this Curtiss type airplane had been built by a gentleman by the name of Howard Gill, and Benoist bought the airplane from Gill and learned how to fly it. And he was soon flying exhibitions around the Midwest and South with his Gill Curtiss. Ironically, an injury sustained during one of these exhibitions kept him from a scheduled participation in a major international aviation meet, only the second such meet in the U.S. that was here at St. Louis in mid-October. Benoist recovered quickly, however, and on December 22nd became the first St. Louisan to be granted a pilot's license by the Aero Club of America. Early in 1911, Benoist established facilities for a flying school that was initially called the Orosco Flying School, later just the Benoist School of Aviation, at this same Kinloch Field up in North St. Louis County. And he began instructing students in March of 1911. The widespread reputation established by the Benoist's Orosco Supply House enabled the school to attract students from all around the country. At this same time, after having bought out his partner in Orosco, Benoist relocated his supply company to a larger facility in suburban St. Louis and renamed it from Orosco to Benoist Aircraft Company to reflect the growing emphasis of the concern on manufacturing and marketing airplanes of its own design instead of these Wright Type and Curtiss Type and so forth designs that for which he had previously been peddling materials. He's now launching it, and the first home design was Benoist's own version of the Gill Curtiss. Benoist's own version of this airplane, this Gill Curtiss biplane. It was known simply as the Benoist biplane and was typical of the many Curtiss biplane copies being built and flown throughout the country at the time. The pilot and passenger sat on the leading edge of the lower wing with the engine and pusher propeller located behind him. You can't really see it clearly here, but this thing is driven by a pusher propeller that's behind the pilot and rotating behind the wings. The elevator was, as in this Gill Curtiss design, the elevator was supported out ahead of the wings, while the vertical and horizontal tail surfaces were supported after the wings. And I already mentioned the Curtiss type so-called floating ailerons, as opposed to the Wright approach, which you recall was a matter of warping the entire frame of the wing to change the lift coefficient.
Fred, were there two elevators?
No, the in the rear was basically a stabilizer.
No, I mean,
yeah. On this Gill Curtiss anyway. Yeah, there were the elevator structure involved both those surfaces. Now, Benoist employed this airplane type for student instruction and for exhibition flying throughout 1911. Both the school and the manufacturing operation were highly successful, and Benoist airplanes and pilots were soon appearing around the country. But Benoist suffered a major blow when, on October 20th of that year, the Benoist Aircraft Company facility burned to the ground. The uninsured loss included 5 complete airplanes, tools, specialized machinery, and all files. Talk about a total loss. Benoist was able to obtain comparable factory space just a few blocks away and quickly set about reestablishing Benoist aircraft operations. Despite this setback, Benoist was able to complete design and construction of a new biplane before 1911 came to a close. Benoist's new biplane, identified as the Type 12, and it was given the Roman numeral Type 12 because its intended year of introduction was 1912. And that numbering procedure was sustained pretty much through the Benoist line of activity. But this was the first original design of Benoist and his company. It was co-designed with Anthony Janis, who had joined Benoist months earlier and would soon become Benoist's chief pilot. The Type 12 was a very rugged dual control biplane, good for instructional purposes, of conventional pusher arrangement. And you'll notice it differs from the earlier Curtiss design that I pointed out, in that there's no structure out in front of the pilot and passenger. And for that reason, this configuration, as it evolved, was called headless. And this Benoist Type 12 was the originator in this country of the so-called headless configuration. A number of novel features were incorporated into the Type 12 that were oriented toward facilitating its knockdown and packaging and shipment for exhibition purposes. The wings were designed and built in segments so they could be unbolted from one another and stuck in crates and shipped to a destination and bolted back together, and the plane flown pretty handily. Recognizing the impact on the airframe of rough landings, Benoist designed a simple landing gear that would absorb and cushion loads while transmitting the strain. You can kind of see that the landing gear structure here is pretty elaborate, mechanically elaborate and everything. The whole idea was to transmit the unsteady landing loads directly to the engine support and engine mount, because that was the most massive part of the airplane and the strongest part of the support. Now, I mentioned the interchangeable wing sections could be taken apart and easily put back together again. And these control surfaces, you know, notice he's still got between the main planes control surfaces, ailerons if you want to call them that, but they're configured a little bit differently from the way they were on the Curtiss type design. Here, Benoist has got them kind of spring mounted, so there's a mechanical resistance to movement of these control surfaces. And the surfaces were warped rather than deflected on hinges. Power for the machine was a 6-cylinder, and this would become very famous or a very regular part of the Benoist line. A 6-cylinder, 2-cycle, 75 horsepower Roberts engine, which was then widely used as a marine, i.e. boat, power plant. Now, with Tony Janis piloting, a Type 12 headless participated in a headline gathering event on March 1st of 1912. Interestingly enough, just a smidge over 100 years ago. We'll get to that in just a second. But Captain Bert Berry, right here, who was the son of balloonist John Berry. John Berry was a famous balloonist who manufactured balloons here and these were not, back in this day, balloons were lifted aloft by coal gas and so forth, not by, they often are incorrectly referred to as hot air balloons. There were no hot air balloons back in this day, except the ones that the Montgolfier brothers had flown to France back in the late 1700s. But anyway, Bert Berry, son of balloonist John Berry, made the first ever parachute drop from an airplane in flight over Jefferson Barracks in suburban St. Louis. Here's a shot of, I had originally thought this was Berry landing and collapsing his chute on the parade grounds at JB, but in fact it's apparently him practicing the job of collapsing his chute. I'm sure the question came up, well, what are you going to do, Bert, if you land in your parachute and there's a wind blowing? You're going to let it drag you all the way down to the Mississippi? And he obviously thought, no, that wouldn't work. So he practiced collapsing the chute in a bit of a breeze before they actually made the drop at JB. And this is the event that was alluded to earlier in connection with Chuck and Charlie Benoist, who are here this evening. They were present at the centennial celebration and reenactment of that first parachute drop, which was this reenactment and centennial celebration was done on the 1st of March of this year, down at JB, of course. But now, the idea of dropping soldiers with parachutes from an airplane kind of caught on, but I should point out that in order to get out of this conical device here was the housing for the canopy of the parachute. And so to make his drop, Berry had to start out riding alongside Tony Janis, and then when they got over JB parade ground, he had to climb down through the landing gear structure here, suspend himself beneath the landing gear, and drop free, pulling the parachute canopy. Of course, they did it with the fingers crossed, but it did work out, pulling the parachute canopy out of that conical container. And this idea of dropping armed soldiers from an airplane seemed to have a lot of merit, but the idea of having them clamber down through all this landing gear structure was kind of a no-brainer.
What was their airspeed?
What's that?
What was their airspeed when they dropped out?
About 65.
65?
Sounds about right, yeah. Fast enough to stay in the air, but not too fast to blow Bert Berry off the landing gear or whatever. And I can identify with that, having done my first skydive about 6 years ago.
And how high were they?
1,500 feet.
Okay. I'll accept that. I went out at 3,500 feet.
Were you there?
Only in spirit. But anyway, the idea of evolving the airplane to make it a whole lot simpler for paratrooper, what became a paratrooper, to get off the airplane led to converting that Type 12 from a headless airplane into a tractor airplane by moving the engine out front and making a very slim aft fuselage. I call it the sit-on fuselage, but it would have the armed soldier or whatever who's going to parachute off kind of sitting astride that fuselage as though he was were on the back of a horse, and then just going over the side and dropping off. What could be simpler, right? Unless you go out the cargo door. But anyway, Benoist evolved the Type 12 into a tractor airplane, engine and everything out in front. And this was kind of a new development at the time, because airplanes had started out, you know, Wright brothers did pusher airplanes and Curtiss did pusher airplanes. And so putting the engine out front with a tractor propeller was kind of a new development that Fenwal and company were in on. Interestingly enough, a further improved version involved fattening up the fuselage so that the pilot and the passenger could sit inside, protected from the wind, inside the fuselage. And this was the evolution was called the Type 12 cross-country plane. And this particular example of the Type 12 is very interesting because we'll see it later. If you look closely, I don't know if you can read that it says number 31 on the side. That was Benoist Type 12, number 31, which was built at the Benoist shop by the Korn brothers who were from Ohio. And the airplane got a lot of public use, demonstration use and everything by the Korn brothers. And in fact, it ended up as the only original Benoist airframe still in existence. Yes?
And was that in U City? That was here in St. Louis, in U City? Or wherever the Benoist shop was?
Yeah, yeah. On Delmar. Well, then that was where it started out, and then it evolved up to Kinloch Field along with Benoist Flying School. But anyway, I'll get back to this. Well, as I say, and we'll see later, it's the only original Benoist airframe that's still in existence, and it's been restored by the National Air and Space Museum and is presently on display in the Udvar-Hazy Museum just north of Washington, which is kind of a branch of the National Air and Space Museum. But here it was, one of the Korn Brothers airplane, one of the early Type 12 cross countries, hopping rides at today we call it an air show, then it was an aerial exhibition back in 1912. It was a very successful airplane. And in fact, you see here's the same airplane, the Korn Brothers airplane, number 31, on floats. And it was used by, piloted by Tony Janis, who had become Benoist's chief pilot. And it was flown a total of 1,973 miles. Not non-stop, trust me. 1,973 miles over a portion of the Missouri River to St. Louis, and then down the Mississippi from St. Louis to New Orleans over 21 days. And of course, this has made a lot of publicity. And in fact, here they're supposedly loading a case of Falstaff beer, made in St. Louis, of course, aboard the Benoist Type 12 for delivery to the mayor of New Orleans at the end of the flight.
What year was that?
What's that?
What year did they do that?
Who would attempt that float?
That was 1912.
1912. Air stuff when it was silly.
The case didn't make it there.
Hey, we don't have the dates here. I'm sorry.
In 1912.
It was in 1912, 41-day period in 1912. And I think, if I remember correctly, the story of it, there had been a contract let to Glenn Curtis to do something similar because he was very much into water-based airplanes, float planes like this, and as we'll see momentarily, Curtis was a leader in the evolution of what we call the flying boat. But Curtis was not able to successfully make the flight, so Benoist and Janis got together and put on this tremendous show in 1912, successfully getting all the way down to New Orleans. But I mentioned that Benoist was very much involved in this float plane stuff, and he was able to attract a guy by the name of Harold Robinson from the Curtis Company, and along with Robinson came some clues to the new approach to water flying, and that was the flying boat hull. And so Benoist used, as you can tell here, used the wings and ailerons from the Type 12 and built a boat hull to which to attach them, and to preserve balance and stability on the water, they put the engine down in the hull and drove the propeller by chain drive so that they wouldn't end up with cases of coming down for a landing and digging in the nose of the boat hull and having the mass of the engine just carry forward and flip the airplane over. But you see here the original configuration, and if I'm not mistaken, this was taken at one of Benoist's favorite water-based airplane flying sites, which was Creve Lake. But that's the original configuration. You see it's got the original Benoist type ailerons on it and everything. Here's the improved airplane or configuration of what became known as a Type 13, because of course its year of introduction was 1913. Here's the improved configuration. One of the improvements is Benoist has picked up on the idea of trailing edge ailerons, as you can see on this setup. And he's improved the tail surfaces a little bit. And all of that led to one of the more important developments, which was the establishment by a fellow by the name of Percy Fansler from down in St. Petersburg, who learned of Benoist's activities and got together with Benoist and established a contract under which Benoist and Tony Janis and so forth would use Benoist flying boats, only now a modified version was called the Type 14, introduced in 1914. But it's very similar to the Type 13. And here you see it. This shot is of the inaugural flight of the St. Petersburg-Tampa airport line, the first ever regularly scheduled airline operation in the world. And its purpose was to fly back and forth, I don't know how many miles it is, 7 or 8 miles or something like that, across Tampa Bay between St. Petersburg and Tampa, shaving an awful lot of time off the time required to ride a train or drive on the highway around the edge of Tampa Bay. And it was a very successful operation during 3 months in the and the reason it only operated for 3 months was that was the extent of the contract that had been established. But it gained a lot of attention for Benoist and for airline operations, and led to more successful use by Benoist and Janis of the flying boat. And it became highly popular and put on lots of exhibitions and flew rides. And here was one of the very famous areas, and that is on the southern shore of Lake Erie at Cedar Point, which is right near Sandusky, Ohio. And here there was a hotel operator, a resort operator there at Cedar Point, who hired Benoist and Janis to do exhibition flying and to fly rides here at over Lake Erie out of the Cedar Point area. And here's Janis taxiing through the surf, coming up on the beach at Cedar Point with one of the Type 14s. Bigger ideas abounded because in 1913, London Daily Mail, which was a great sponsor of challenging aviation events such as the first one to fly between point A and point B, or somebody to make the quickest flight between point B and point C. But London Daily Mail established a $50,000 prize for the first transatlantic flight to be completed within 72 hours. And Benoist and Janis got together, and initially they thought they would just use a developed version of the Benoist Type 14, but they realized it was going to take more lifting power than that and more engine power to carry all the fuel and so forth. So they evolved the Type 15 twin-engine flying boat. Type 15 because its year of introduction was to be 1915. You can see that in concept it's very similar to the Type 14, except a bit larger. Now it's got a 65-foot wingspan and 2 100-horsepower Roberts engines. And these engines are not buried in the hull, as you can see. They're actually mounted as direct drive engines. An interesting aspect of this is that because Benoist's shop was not big enough to accommodate the fabrication of this large flying boat, arrangements were made with the St. Louis Car Company down on the riverfront. St. Louis Car Company being a manufacturer of railway cars and so forth, as you probably realize. And they had plenty of room, and in fact you can see here this image of the Type 15 under construction. In the background you can see a railroad passenger car. Or for all I know it may be a subway car, but it's some kind of railroad car in the back where they're working on this Type 15. And in 1915, this image shows it on a flight test over the Mississippi River. And the intention was they were going to go after this $50,000 Daily Mail prize. And
looks like I was just going to say, looks like he went back to the earlier style vertical on the tail.
you mean
The rudder, yes.
Rudder without stabilizer?
Yes.
Yeah, it could very well be. I will admit to not knowing all the engineering details of these Fenwal machines.
Fred, do you know, was it the experience that the St. Louis Car Company had building this, did that enable them to get the contract to build Jennies during the war?
Yeah, I think the, well, it wasn't a matter of the St. Louis Car Company going out after a contract. It was the Army running around the country because there was no large-scale established aircraft manufacturing industry in this country prior to World War I. When it was decided the United States was going to enter the war, and one of the things they were going to do was provide some aviation services in Europe. We had to train a bunch of pilots and acquire a bunch of airplanes, and there were no existing manufacturing facilities to do so. So the Army came to places like St. Louis and went to St. Louis Car and said, okay, you are very experienced in metal fabrication. Let's put you together with Huttig, Sash, and Door, woodworkers, and form a combined company, St. Louis Aircraft Company, to build, was it 450 or something like that, JN-4 Jennies during the First World War. But this experience that St. Louis Car already had under its belt may very well have fostered that. And not only that, but when the war broke out and scotched the idea of this transatlantic flight business, Benoist, along with St. Louis Car, tried to interest the British in buying the Benoist Type 15 as an anti-submarine patrol flying boat. And of course, they offered to build at least 1,000 of them in the St. Louis Car shops. But of course, Benoist and St. Louis Car got beat out by Glenn Curtis with the well-known Curtis Type F twin-engine flying boat. Well, anyway, that didn't dissuade Mr. Benoist at all, because in 1916 he evolved the Type 13 and 14 flying boat into something that made use of a sheet steel tail boom and a higher power engine, now a 100 horsepower Roberts engine. And the engine, as you can see, is no longer mounted down in the hull. It's mounted in direct drive fashion up between the main planes. But there were several of these built, I think, for this one shown here in this image is one of several that were built for the Staten Island School of Aeronautics. Don't think they ever kept one though.
Fred,
Yes,
is that fuselage broken there?
in that image.
No,
No, the tail boom is canted.
That much?
Yeah, they tried to keep the tail in the prop board.
is that a tractor or a
Put
push?
prop is up that high.
It's still a pusher, or is it?
No, it's.
No, I
it's a
guess
tractor.
by this one, it's become a tractor. And anyway, that same concept of using the sheet steel for the tail boom showed up in a land plane that was a Type 17 called Steelclad cross-country plane. You can see it's got this, what is it, 6-cylinder, 100 horsepower Roberts up front in the tractor configuration. And you can kind of see some of the bends and so forth in this rolled sheet steel tail boom. And you can see the similarity of that tail boom to the one on the previous flying boat, except here on the land plane it isn't canted.
No windscreen on any of these.
What's that?
There's no windscreen, the windshield.
That's what goggles are for, Joe.
Now, hey, Fred, you see the tail skids, but it almost looks like there's a auxiliary, like a nose wheel type arrangement going on there.
Good rudder on that.
Anti-prop strike device.
Okay.
You can start to really make it up.
Because if you bump down hard, the tail skid's not going to do you much good. You don't want to roll in nose over into the prop. But anyway, as a postscript, let me just point out what I know of, or at the time I did this, what I knew of existing Benoist aircraft. You remember I kept referring to the Korn Brothers Type 12. Well, here it is as I photographed it in the Garber facility, which was in Silver Hill, Maryland, at the time I was there about 15 years ago. And it had been restored and was on display, and it really caught my eye there. And I have learned that it is now on exhibit in the new NASM Udvar-Hazy facility. That is, to my knowledge, the only original Benoist airframe still in any kind of reasonable existence. And it's been completely and methodically restored. And back in 1984, and we had some of these people from St. Pete up here in St. Louis going to the History Museum, digging out whatever materials they could find on the Benoist flying boat, because they built a replica Benoist Type 14 for a 1984 reenactment of the establishment of that Tampa St. Pete airboat line. And they did successfully fly it, and you can see an image of that here. And it's presently, since that reenactment, it's been on exhibit in a waterfront museum in St. Petersburg. And I might add to that there's a group up, one of those original Type 14s that was flown between Tampa and St. Pete, got sold to individuals up in Duluth, Minnesota, and named the Lark of Duluth. And it was flown on exhibitions and everything up there in the west end of Lake Superior. And there's a group up there now that is endeavoring to build a replica, flyable replica of the Lark of Duluth. And Mark or Jack, any of you guys know what the schedule is when that intention is to fly that thing?
The anniversary is is 2014 is the 100th anniversary for that. And then Kermit Weeks is also doing one to go back to basically this
Kermit
history.
Weeks is his museum still Wings and Wheels Museum?
Fantasy of Flight.
Oh, Fantasy of
And
Flight.
Chuck, you said you'd been there, right?
Yes, not recently.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's we were able to go into the area where they're building this plane now, and they showed it.
Where Kermit Weeks is building it?
Kermit Weeks has got his fellow by the name. His head man is. I can't think of it right now.
Yeah, just a little mention about the Type 12 that's displayed down at the Udvar-Hazy facility. That's actually it's just west of Washington. It's just north of near Dulles International Airport.
Yeah.
But in the past year, the National Air and Space Museum closed the Garber facility and moved their storage and restoration facilities from Garber to Udvar-Hazy. They recently put in an addition.
One of the reasons for the existence of Garber was just exactly that, a storage facility for all the wonderful stuff that NASM couldn't restore and put on display in the National Air and Space Museum.
Yeah, the one in the National Mall.
And that's why Udvar-Hazy ended up getting developed.
Yeah, and now they've got
spillover
storage and restoration facilities moving there too.
Yeah.
Just thought I'd throw that out there.
Mr. Tom Krause who is overall his planes before 19 and 20, I believe, everything below it. Anyway, he explained to us that that new museum It's humidistat control. It keeps all the materials in better shape, even the astronauts stuff and all that. And the old museum that you mentioned, their planes and stuff was deteriorating, so that's one reason for.
You're talking about the
Sure.
play facility at Garber?
Yeah. So that's the new one.
Well, yeah, Woodvar-Hazy was designed and built from the ground up as a real museum and not as a converted old building. And as you suggest, Charles, there's a lot of difference.
I think Kermit is also having 2 of the engines built too. Yeah, they found drawings.
Replica Roberts engines.
Yes.
Yeah, the Roberts engine, it was, like you said, it's 6-cylinder. They're having 3 blocks cast now,
Right.
what they call reverse engineering. And I think they told us down there that.
But they do start by taking measurements from the Type 12 engine at Woodvar-Hazy.
They actually found drawings in Kansas, in the Museum of Kansas for the Roberts engine, and were able to obtain those drawings, and that's what they're
There are
doing.
lots of boat races in there.
Well, yeah, like you said, it came from the Marine engine, so, but I'm sure, if you go to the Fantasy of Flight website, he has a blog, and
Yes.
if you Google it, it'll pop up, but he has a blog ongoing about the building of his replica.
Yeah, that's very good with pictures. They had the wood masters for the cylinder block up there the other day with photographs of that. Alan, can we get on the net through this?
I don't know if that's hooked up or not.
Okay, well.
One of those
That's my
engines.
story, and I'm sticking to it, the short story of,
Okay. Fred, one of those engines is going to go to Duluth, Minnesota, and 1 permanent weeks and 1 spare. Is what they told us.
so if you need a 100-horse Roberts Marine engine, where would it go?
One of the things I thought was interesting when we were looking at this replica airplane, of course, they didn't have a Roberts engine. They used the General Motors for this thing. And it's a chain drive to a suspended block for that prop. It's suspended by cables. And they had a big problem. Every time they'd start it, they'd stretch the chain. And it fatigued the chain so much they had to develop a way to start the engine under much less stress. Start it slower.
Pre-tension
Change and bring it up to speed. So when such a shock is started.
Well, it's all engineering.
That's what we got engineers for, right?
And when we were there in Florida recently, that replicas on the wharf at St. Petersburg, they dropped it down to the floor and let us examine it. Said, we don't do this for everybody, but for Benoist, we will. Hands on.
They let the lightweight guy actually get in it, that, you know.
Well, they took the dummy out, which was Teal, the first passenger, and put this dummy in.
You got pictures to prove that.
Yeah.
Right here.
I say with you.
I thought it was kind of neat too, they had a postage stamp for this commemorative flight that they did in '84. U.S. postage stamp for that.
Fred, on that Type 12 in the upper picture, exactly how does that torsion, I understand it's a torsion type setup for the aileron, but how does that physically work? Is it just, it looks like it's fixed to the end struts, that it doesn't physically pitch up and down like an aileron?
Well, no, in the final configuration, later on in the Type 12, it twists.
Okay. So, that's interesting.
It's sort of a, somewhere between a Wright and the Curtis lateral control device.
It seems like even in, I was looking at the Type 15 while ago you showed, but also in the 14 replica, I don't see those those floating.
No, they went
ailerons
to,
that you
he went to
speak.
standard
By
ailerons.
that time they're
Okay.
using trailing edge.
Okay.
Were those ailerons both on the upper and lower wing? Looked to me like it was.
Yeah.
Was that considered a 2-axis or a 3-axis?
3-axis, you've got ailerons, rudder, and elevator. Just doesn't have a fixed horizontal, well,
Yeah, it's got
this model does because it's actually the
It's-
stance to get the stab up.
It's a successful airplane, so it's got 3 degrees of freedom, so 3-axis control. Right, Jack?
Let's do it. Yeah, let's do it.
Was so far off the radar that during that same time period, Wright and Curtis were having their day-to-day in court with the patents and everything going on with the Aileron. Was Benoist involved in any of this?
Not that I'm
No,
aware of.
they left him out of it.
They ignored it.
And then when World War I started, everything stopped.
The government told them to shut it down.
Shut her down, yeah.
Everything stopped and the NACA was established and all that kind of good stuff. Joe?
Yeah, I'd asked these gentlemen at Jefferson Barracks that day if they knew Hunt Benoist. Did you know Hunt? Hunt Benoist was a pilot at McDonald when I started to work there in 1952. He was a Navy pilot, flew in the reserves, and flew Banshees for McDonald.
Apparently he wasn't in a relation.
He claimed he was.
Oh, is that really?
Yeah.
Was his first name Hunt?
Hunt. He became mayor of Titan later on, died several years ago.
One other point I wanted to point, when Uncle Tom was in St. Louis producing an airplane, that was charged him $15 every time he took a student off the ground in the flying field. More or less kind of priced him out of it. He only got $350 for it. Train a pilot anyway, and he took $15 every time he took that trainee off the ground, which was very unfair. And a second thing, they required him to have
representation.
They required him to have 3 different licenses. He said, "All I need is a federal license." They made him buy federal, state, and city. So the family feels like St. Louis isn't pretty fair.
Flight instructors are getting paid about the same today. I was teaching at $20 an hour. $5 more.
$15 back in that day was quite a bit.
Brett, how did he pass away?
Oh yeah, I didn't mention that. It's covered in the paper, but I don't have images of it.
Was it stamp you're talking about?
I think I paid $10 an hour when I learned.
Of the replica deal? Yeah. Anniversary stamp.
Anyway, something I should have mentioned, and Mark just reminded me of it, and that is that Tom Benoist's career was so short because after some of the difficulties, political and what have you, as they're just being mentioned, taxation difficulties here in this area, and some other financial difficulties, he ended up moving himself and his operation by way of Chicago to Sandusky, Ohio, next door to the Roberts Engine Factory, giving him a good hand on the supply of engines that he was using. But while there, he was riding on a streetcar near the factories and leaned out, as I understand the story, leaned out to step off the streetcar and managed to crack his head on a street lamppost and succumbed from it. And this was in what? 17?
17, yeah.
So that put an end to the approximately 10-year aeronautical career of Thomas Benoist. And there have been those who have said that had he survived and pulled himself up by the bootstraps, we might be flying Benoist airliners rather than Boeing airliners today. Who knows?